So let me just move on from there and go to South Africa, of course, where the country has protested the latest 30% tariff salvo fired at the continent's most advanced economy by the U.S. President Donald Trump. The South African President Ramaphosa described the tariff announcement on Monday as unilateral and unjustifiable, even as trade teams from both sides continue their negotiations that started about a month ago. Let's get a bit of a drill down into the latest development as we bring on the show Chris Hart, the executive chairman at Impact Africa Investment. Sir, we're happy to have you once again on the RS Exchange. A good afternoon to you over there in the United States.
As I say, I am in the United States at the moment. We're trying to raise capital for a project in South Africa. It's very well received so far, but and it's quite well advanced. We started the negotiations last year already, but the developments, with the trade is not something that we welcome at all. I think if I could summarize from a South African point of view, and I think even the continent's point of view, when we trade with the US, we are able to open factories. When we stop trading with the US, we close those factories. It's the opposite with China. When we trade with China, we close factories. Chinese don't take manufactured goods, whereas the US does. And that's the importance of the US-South African trade relationships. It's actually quite a critical part of our trade balance. We've got a surplus of trade with the United States, and of course, the tariffs are there meant to level affairs, because what it seems to be is that the Trump administration is saying we want fair trade. All right. In other words, if we allow goods into our country at X, you've got to allow goods from the US at a similar sort of level, and that's what they're busy doing. Is they're busy matching tariffs, and this is where South Africa needs to actually look at that and see. This is something that shouldn't be difficult to do, but I know there's a lot of vested interests in the trade negotiations, and trade relations are very, very tricky, at least on a political level, and this is what's being navigated at the moment.
Yes. Chris, President Ramaphosa described the latest tariff as unilateral and unjustifiable. So what type of response should South Africa be working on right now, and with what objective?
Well, that's where it's interesting is if the tariffs the US is imposing is unjustifiable, how is the tariffs that South Africa imposes on the US justifiable? And this is what I think is not well understood in terms of these things. The Trump administration has come in and said, looking at the global relationships, and they interpret themselves as with an enormous trade deficit as being the buy of last resort for the rest of the world, but nobody buys stuff from them because they put barriers to US goods in reciprocity, and they say they don't want that. So it's an interesting thing. I think we have to come up with a more practical and pragmatic view. The South African foreign relationship attitude towards the US has been hostile. I think in the United Nations, anything that the US is voting for, we're voting against. That's South Africa, and that's almost on 100% of the issues. South Africa, for instance, has taken Israel to taken them to court, International Court of Justice, and that, of course, is not something that's in the interests of the US security, and likewise, its friendship with Iran is also not in the US's interest. So the US is taking the US. Don't cherry pick from the US, right, and then spit in our faces on the other thing. That's the US's position. And from South Africa's position, it's really a case of to choose. Are we going to choose Iran over the US? Are we going to choose effectively BRICS over the US? And if that's what we're going to do, it's going to have some damaging relationships, and we're going to see if that gets compensated with the relationships that the government chooses to hold. The problem is that the government is a minority government, right? Certainly the ANC is only got 40% of the seats in parliament, and they're there as a coalition, and the coalition partners are not in agreement with the stance the ANC has taken on international relationships.
Yes, the government of national unity is just about a year. The elections was at the end of May last year, so this is just the first year, as it were, for the GNU in South Africa. The impact of this tariff, touch on that for me for 1 second very quickly. What sectors are going to be hit the most in South Africa with this 30% if it goes into effect? The agriculture minister yesterday says South Africa should go quickly to the negotiating table before the 30-day window lapses.
Yes. Yeah, so basically agriculture is an important export to the US, and the relationship there is very symbiotic because of the different seasons. So in the it's summer here, winter in South Africa, vice versa, obviously, as we get through to December. And so the US market is a very important agricultural export market for South Africa and other African countries as well. The other is high-end manufactured goods, like, for instance, motor vehicles. We export quite a lot of motor vehicles. In US terms, it's not a lot, but in South African terms, it actually is a lot. And it's from a point of view of the multipliers that occur in the country, the motor industry is an exceptionally important manufacturing component of our industry, and it's not just the multipliers; it's also the actual sophistication and high-end manufacture, end product manufacture, effectively that we are. It's not just the beginning of the value chain, like for instance, processing iron ore into steel, for instance, and then exporting that. In other words, it's right at the other end of the value chain. And so it's actually critically important for the economy to remain, to retain its sophistication, to retain its ability to manufacture. The motor industry is one of the most important manufacturing industries in South Africa, and that is something that is at risk because without the US export, the economies of scale don't work well.
Okay, so you are an investment executive, Chris, and I want you to tell me what you're hearing on the ground since these face-off started between Washington and Pretoria since President Trump returned to office in January. What's the sentiment out there, globally speaking, towards South Africa in terms of investment flows, whether it is portfolio? Of course, we know that stocks investors have taken more than about 100 billion rand out of South Africa's stock market since about a year or so. So investors in risky assets, including bonds, were going out. What about foreign direct investment? Are you seeing the body language that South Africa still is the place to go when it comes to investments into Africa?
What we find is that a lot of your major companies are leaving South Africa. We're seeing Shell leave, we're seeing Chevron leave. Those are the oil companies. In the mining industry, we've seen Billiton leave, we've seen Rio Tinto also getting out. Even Anglo America, homegrown South African global mining giant, is actually to a large extent exiting South Africa. So, and this is largely because of policies that are not investor friendly. I think you'll appreciate that my commentary to your network has been a consistent theme, is that we need to make ourselves more attractive from an investment point of view. The economic policy is too ideologically driven and too driven by factors rooted in apartheid. But these things have got nothing to do with the current investors, and they're not interested in that in those issues, which they don't need to face anywhere else in the world. And one really needs to look at the revision of those policies The US, for instance, has laid it out very clearly. They're looking at 4 specific issues. One of them is an exemption of BEE legislation for US companies, which they're interpreting increasingly as a non-tariff barrier for them to be able to participate in the economy. And that's going to be extremely difficult ideologically for the government to actually swallow, right? And yet it's becoming a critical imperative. And that is the dichotomy. They're also looking at other issues such as genocidal or struggle songs that have genocidal type of threads in it to actually be condemned officially by the government, which of course will be very difficult because they're also part of the liberation struggle.
Yeah.
And so they hold these so-called struggle songs near and dear to them, even though it's no longer appropriate given the context of how South Africa has actually moved on. And so these are the things that really we have to grapple with internally.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, what's happened, ideology has how could I say, taken the front stage, and the practical real economy is struggling as a result of that. And we need to actually see a more pragmatic approach to the way we actually deal with economic policy and foreign policy.
All right, it's always a pleasure touching base with you anytime, Chris Hart, out there in Florida today. Thank you so much for your contributions, and we wish you all the best for making deals out there for South Africa. Thank you so much, Chris Hart, Executive Chairman at Impact Africa Investment. Have a great day.